She is unfit. The words cut through the air like a blade. Delivered with the icy precision of Jordan Peterson, they didn't need volume to dominate the room. They carried the weight of dismissal, the authority of someone long accustomed to towering over his challengers. For a brief, breathless moment, time itself seemed to hold still. The crowd gasped, a ripple of murmurs sweeping across the chamber like the sudden shift of a storm. All eyes turned to Jasmine Crockett. She did not flinch. Her chest rose slowly, her gaze steady, as though she had been bracing her entire life for this exact moment. The insult hung above her like smoke, heavy and suffocating, but she refused to inhale it. Across from her, Peterson's face remained cold, confident, the smirk of a man convinced he had just ended the debate before it even began. This was not just a clash of words. It was theater, it was spectacle, it was the ancient drama of power trying to silence dignity. Peterson stood there not merely as an individual, but as a symbol of elitist authority. The intellectual giant who believed his stature alone could crush the spirit of those he deemed lesser, and Crockett, sharp, unapologetically herself, was cast as the target of that arrogance. The room buzzed with tension. Supporters of Peterson nodded in agreement, their arms crossed in smug approval. Others shifted uneasily, sensing the cruelty in his words. And in the middle of it all, Crockett stood in silence, her hands folded, her composure ironclad. That silence was louder than any rebuttal she could have offered in that instant. It was the silence of calculation, of gathering strength, of knowing. Something no one else in the room yet understood because, while Peterson basked in his moment of triumph, he was blind to the storm about to break. Crockett's eyes gave nothing away, but within them burned the certainty of a counterstrike.
Oh.
She carried with her something Peterson could not anticipate, something he could not dismiss with a scoff or an insult, and when she chose to reveal it, the arrogance of a giant would collapse in front of millions. The room, the crowd, the entire country had no idea what was coming next. But in that silence, no one expected the tape she carried would turn the room upside down. The insult did not exist in a vacuum. When Jordan Peterson branded Jasmine Crockett unfit, it wasn't just one person cutting down another. It was a declaration layered with centuries of hierarchy, a performance that echoed the oldest scripts of power. America has heard versions of these words before. They were spoken when immigrants were told they would never belong, when women were told they were too fragile for leadership, when voices from the margins were silenced by those convinced that intellect and authority belonged only to the few. Peterson knew the weight of his reputation. To many, he is a scholar, a public thinker, a giant in the world of debate. His voice carries the gravity of polished diction, years of lecturing, and the aura of someone who has been allowed to stand above the crowd. And when he looked at Crockett, his words were not simply about her, they were about the countless people she represented. By calling her unfit, he was attempting to draw a line between who is deemed worthy to speak and who must remain silent. But Crockett's presence in that room was proof of how far that old script had already begun to unravel. She stood not as a token, not as a mere participant, but as a symbol of resistance against the dismissal that has crushed too many before her.
Oh.
Her very existence in that chamber was defiance. We're too young, too brown, too female, too immigrant, too different to be heard. And in the face of Peterson's declaration, those voices did not vanish. They simmered. The stakes were clear. This was not just a sparring match between two personalities. It was the embodiment of a national conversation about who holds legitimacy. In America's public square, when Peterson spoke, he carried the old world of gatekeeping authority, a fortress built on status and tradition. When Crockett stood in silence, she carried the future, the possibility that dignity, perseverance, and lived experience could no longer be dismissed as unworthy. For the audience, this wasn't entertainment alone. It was recognition. Immigrants felt their stories in Crockett's stillness. Women who had been talked over in boardrooms and classrooms recognized the tactic in Peterson's words. Young activists who had been told to wait their turn saw themselves in her poised defiance. The insult landed on her, yes, but the sting was felt by millions, And yet, this is why her silence mattered, because sometimes the loudest rebuttal is not an immediate retort, but the refusal to bow. Crockett's calm composure unsettled Peterson more than any outburst could have. In that instant, the crowd began to wonder, was the giant truly in control, or had he just revealed the insecurity behind his arrogance? Peterson, basking in the confidence of his declaration, could not see what was building. Mistook Crockett's quiet as defeat, not realizing that quiet has always been the prelude to revolution. The room was holding its breath. America was holding its breath. Was this going to be another moment where authority crushed dignity? Would this time be different? Insult might have landed, if not for the storm that was about to break. To understand why Peterson's words landed with such force, one must first understand the figure behind them. Jordan Peterson did not step into that room as an unknown. He carried with him the aura of a public intellectual who had, for years, cultivated a reputation as both sage and provocateur. To his admirers, he was the voice of reason in a chaotic world, a man who dared to speak truths others were too afraid to utter. To his critics, he was the polished mask of arrogance, cloaking dismissal of progress in the language of intellectual rigor. Peterson's rise was meteoric. Professor from Canada, he first entered the public consciousness by railing against what he saw as the overreach of identity politics. His lectures went viral, his debates trended, his book sales soared. To millions, he was the calm, methodical voice that gave order to a confusing age. They saw in him a kind of modern philosopher king, an unyielding defender of logic, standing tall against what he painted as chaos, yet beneath the polished cadence, there was always a contradiction. For all his talk of truth, Peterson often wielded his intellect not as a tool to build bridges, but as a weapon to diminish. His critics pointed out how often his arguments slipped into caricature, how icily he dismissed the lived experiences of those who challenged him. Perhaps most striking of all was the way he wielded authority. The posture of a man convinced that sharpness of mind alone conferred the right to decide who was fit and who was not. This was the shadow behind the praise. Yes, he could inspire young men searching for guidance. Yes, he could command a room with his voice. Yes, he could debate with precision. But too often that precision cut downward, slicing not at ideas, but at people. The phrase, "she is unfit," was not a spontaneous remark, it was the culmination of a pattern where those who stood outside his worldview were not simply debated, but declared illegitimate. And that pattern mattered, because in the court of public opinion, repetition creates perception. When an intellectual giant repeatedly dismisses dissent as unworthy, audiences begin to believe that dismissal is truth. Peterson's power lay not only in his arguments, but in the way his authority amplified his words until they became more than opinion, they became judgment. For many watching, when he branded Crockett unfit, it was as though the gavel had fallen. But here lies the danger in such authority. The higher the pedestal, the greater the fall. By leaning so heavily on his reputation, Peterson also magnified his vulnerability. His devotees expected perfection, yet perfection is a mirage. His insistence on absolute judgment left no room for humility, no space for reconsideration. And arrogance, when left unchecked, is never static. It grows. It hardens. It begins to mistake dominance for invincibility. That was what the audience witnessed in that chamber, a man whose confidence had crossed the line into hubris. Peterson was no longer simply debating ideas. He was rendering verdicts on people. He stood there, draped in the authority of his reputation, convinced that his pronouncement would settle the matter once and for all. But history is not kind to hubris. The greatest of intellectuals, the most celebrated of thinkers, have stumbled when they allowed their certainty to blind them. And in that moment, Peterson could not see what was right before him. Crockett's calm silence, her steady gaze, her quiet resistance. He mistook restraint for weakness, calculation for paralysis. What he could not know, what he refused to even consider, was that his own pattern of arrogance was setting the stage for his undoing. Because when you dismiss others as unfit, you invite the world to examine your own fitness. And when you stand so tall on the foundation of pride, even the smallest crack can bring the whole structure crashing down. But arrogance has a way of setting the stage for its own downfall. Jasmine Crockett's story does not begin in the chamber, where Jordan Peterson hurled his insult. It begins far earlier, in the quiet corners of a world that did not expect her to rise. She grew up in the margins, raised on the unspoken truth that to be heard, she would have to fight twice as hard, stand twice as tall, and refuse again and again to bow before those who told her no. Her childhood was marked not by privilege, but by perseverance. In classrooms where her intelligence was overlooked, she learned to sharpen her voice until it cut through dismissal. In neighborhoods where opportunity felt scarce, she saw firsthand how resilience could transform despair into determination. Crockett was not handed a platform, she built one from the ground up. Brick by brick, with the grit of someone who understood that silence would never be granted to her unless she seized it. Service became her compass. Long before she stood beneath the blinding lights of national attention, she served her community not as a headline, but as a lifeline. Whether fighting for the overlooked in courtrooms or organizing for those whose stories rarely made the news, Crockett's path was paved with sacrifice. She gave her time, her energy, her very identity to the belief that justice was not a gift, but a right. And in that relentless pursuit, she forged the armor that would later allow her to withstand the blows of arrogance. Her journey was not without scars. Each setback etched itself into her memory. The times she was told she was too young to lead, too outspoken to be respected, too different to be taken seriously. Times she refused to bend. Those scars became her map, guiding her toward the very stage where she now stood across from Peterson. They reminded her of every voice she carried with her, every hand that had pushed her forward, every injustice that had fueled her fire. What made her presence so powerful was not merely her biography, it was her refusal to let bitterness take root. Crockett had every reason to be hardened, to allow resentment to define her, but she chose instead to embody resilience. Where others saw obstacles, she saw training grounds. Where others heard unfit, she heard the echo of a challenge she had already conquered countless times before. So when Peterson, with his towering reputation, leveled his insult, Crockett did not tremble. She had been here before, maybe. Not in this exact arena, but in battles that had taught her one essential truth. Dignity is not something granted by others. It is claimed, and she had claimed hers long ago. Her resilience was not theoretical, it was lived. She knew what it meant to walk into spaces where she was underestimated. She knew the sting of being dismissed before she even spoke.
Ow.
But she also knew the thrill of proving them wrong, of turning doubt into applause, of standing firm when others tried to push her aside. That knowledge was her anchor, grounding her in the moment when Peterson's words tried to knock her off balance. Every chapter of her life had prepared her for this confrontation. The classrooms where she refused to be ignored taught her the patience of silence. The courtrooms where she defended the powerless taught her the courage of truth. The communities where she poured her energy taught her the value of solidarity. And all of it combined to make her not only ready to withstand the attack, but to turn it into something greater. That is why the silence after Peterson's insult was not weakness. It was the calm of a woman who had weathered storms before and knew another was coming. It was the composure of someone who had faced down dismissal and transformed it into fuel. She stood not as a victim of arrogance, but as a challenger prepared to expose its fragility, and that recording she carried. It was more than a rebuttal, more than evidence. It was the embodiment of her journey. It symbolized every time she had been told she did not belong, every door she had pushed open despite resistance, every truth she had insisted on speaking. For her, pressing play would not just be an act of defense. It would be the culmination of a life lived in defiance of the word unfit. Peterson could not see it. The crowd did not yet know it, but Crockett did. She knew the weight of her own history, the strength that came from every sacrifice, every scar, every act of service that had shaped her. She was not merely responding to an insult sheet. was answering history, and that's why the recording she carried wasn't just evidence, it was destiny. The chamber did not cool after Peterson's first strike. If anything, the air grew heavier, thick, with the expectation of what might follow. Peterson, sensing the attention he commanded, leaned forward and sharpened the blade. "Unfit," he repeated, slower this time, each syllable landing like a gavel striking wood. "Unfit to lead, unfit to decide, unfit to be taken seriously." His words weren't just aimed at Crockett. They were broadcast to everyone watching, as though he were etching her supposed inadequacy into the permanent record. Gasps rippled again through the audience. Some nodded along, eager to see the giant flex his dominance. Others shifted uncomfortably, uneasy with the spectacle of dismissal being paraded as debate. Yet Peterson pressed on, doubling down as if daring Crockett to crack under the weight of his authority. He listed off his reasons, her inexperience, her background, her identity as though they were irrefutable facts, rather than the old recycled tools of exclusion. Each sentence was delivered with the cadence of a man convinced he had already won. But Crockett did not move. Her hands stayed still, her expression unshaken. She did not let his words corrode her calm. Instead, she held her ground, letting his arrogance echo longer than it deserved. The restraint was almost unnerving. Where the audience expected retaliation, she gave them composure. The tension in the room began to turn. At first, it seemed Peterson had seized control, but as his monologue stretched, the crowd began to sense imbalance. His confidence grew louder, but Crockett's silence grew heavier. The more he insisted she was unfit, the more those watching wondered why he needed to insist at all. Is this strength or desperation disguised as certainty? Crockett's gaze never left him. It was steady, deliberate, piercing in its patience. She listened without interruption, absorbing each barb as though storing them in reserve. To the casual eye, it may have looked like restraint. To those who understood her journey, it was strategy. She knew that arguments delivered in rage can be dismissed, but truth revealed at the right moment can shift the ground beneath an opponent's feet. The murmurs grew louder. Some in the crowd whispered disbelief. How could she stand there, silent, after being struck again and again? Others leaned forward, compelled by the mystery of her restraint. The room was transforming into a pressure chamber, every second stretching longer, every heartbeat punctuating the suspense. Peterson, emboldened by what he mistook as submission, raised his voice further. "This is precisely the danger," he declared, pointing toward her as though rendering final judgment. "When we allow the unfit to rise, we jeopardize the very foundation of our institutions." His words rang out like a verdict, cold and absolute. But then something shifted. Crockett moved not dramatically, but with the smallest gesture, enough to break the trance. She reached into her bag, her movements calm, unhurried, deliberate. The murmurs hushed. Every eye followed her hand, every breath seemed to pause. She withdrew a small device, holding it with quiet certainty. For the first time, Peterson faltered. His words stumbled as he noticed the object in her grasp. The audience leaned in, sensing the change in current, the electricity sparking in the silence. Crockett did not look away from him. She did not raise her voice. She did not argue. She simply held the device as though it were both shield and sword, the calm answer to his thunder. The atmosphere had shifted entirely. What began as Peterson's performance of dominance was now suspense on the edge of revelation. The arrogance that filled the chamber just moments before was thinning, replaced by anticipation so sharp it felt like the room itself might crack open. And then she pressed play. The air was so taut with tension, it seemed to hum. Peterson had just repeated the word unfit, drawing it out like a final verdict. His supporters nodded. Some even clapped softly, as though the matter were settled with the authority of a gavel. Crockett did not answer right away. She let the silence sit, a silence that felt heavier than any word she could have spoken. And then, with the slow precision of someone who knew the ground was about to shift, she reached into her bag and placed a small recording device on the table. The audience leaned forward as one. Even Peterson paused mid-gesture, his hand frozen. In the air, his mouth slightly open. It was the kind of stillness that belongs to storms seconds before they break. Crockett didn't rush. Her voice, calm but steeled with purpose, carried across the room. If we are going to talk about who is fit to serve the people, then the people deserve the truth. And sometimes the truth speaks in a voice we cannot deny. Over the button, for a fraction of a second, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Then a sharp click, and the device came alive. At first, there was nothing but the faint crackle of recorded static. Murmurs rippled across the crowd. Uncertain, curious. Then the voice emerged. A familiar voice. Peterson's own. On the recording, Peterson could be heard in a private setting. His tone stripped of the careful polish he wore in public. He spoke about politics, about communities he deemed unmanageable, about leaders who pander to weakness. It wasn't a single remark, but a tapestry of contempt. Lines that betrayed not just intellectual critique, but disdain, a kind of sneering superiority that cut deeper than any debate stage remark ever could. The first sentence landed like a body blow. Gasps erupted from the front row. Some instinctively turned their eyes toward Peterson, waiting for a rebuttal that did not come. His jaw clenched. On the recording, he continued, "They talk about dignity, but dignity is not for everyone. Some people are simply better suited to lead. The rest must follow, whether they like it or not." The room trembled with energy. It was as if the very foundations of the debate had shifted. Peterson, who moments ago towered as the intellectual giant, now found his own words weaponized against him. Crockett folded her hands, her eyes never leaving him. She didn't need to narrate, didn't need to dramatize. The tape was her argument. The truth was speaking for itself. Peterson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He opened his mouth, but before he could speak, the recording surged on. "You see," his voice continued, dripping with certainty, "representation is wasted when it caters to feelings. Competence is not universal, and no matter how loud they shout, some voices don't matter in the grand scheme." The audience broke. Some gasped audibly, others booed, a ripple of disbelief spreading like fire across the hall. Crockett's supporters erupted in murmurs of outrage. But even among Peterson's followers, there was hesitation. An uneasy glance exchanged here and there. In that hesitation, you could feel the unraveling. Peterson's face flushed crimson, his composure cracking like porcelain under pressure. He raised a finger, attempted to interject, "This is out of context." "This is," but the recording steamrolled him. Another line. It's colder than the rest. "There are those who think identity entitles them to power." But let's be clear. Heritage, history, oppression, these are excuses, not qualifications. This time, the audience didn't just murmur, they roared. Some in outrage, some in uncontainable applause for Crockett's courage. The room had turned into a theater of reckoning, where the intellectual giant was suddenly small, cornered by his own voice, his own unguarded disdain. Crockett finally leaned forward, her tone measured but cutting. "So when you say unfit, perhaps what you really mean is that anyone who doesn't look like you, think like you, or agree with you will never be considered fit in your eyes. But the people listening here today, they decide what fitness looks like, not you." The crowd erupted. Cheers, chants, claps echoing like thunder. Peterson shrank back, his hands tightening on the edge of the podium as though bracing himself. Against a tide he could no longer control, and still the recording had more to give. A final, damning statement. You can dress it up in dignity. You can paint it as justice. But at the end of the day, society runs best when the strong rule, and the weak accept their place. That was it. That was the crack of lightning that split the sky wide open. The intellectual titan, who moments earlier wielded the word unfit like a weapon, was now exposed as a man who believed in hierarchy over humanity, superiority over solidarity. When Crockett clicked the device off, the silence that followed was deafening. Not the silence of anticipation this time, but the silence of a room forever changed. And then, almost on cue, the dam burst. The applause was deafening, not polite but primal, an outpouring of vindication from those who had waited too long to see someone stand tall in the face of arrogance. Peterson sat motionless. the giant now reduced to stillness, his authority drained from him in plain sight. His supporters shifted uneasily, some with heads bowed, others with arms crossed. Wrestling with the words they had just heard, Crockett stood, her presence amplified not by volume but by gravity. She did not need to gloat. She had already won. She raised her hand slightly, quieting the crowd just enough to let her words pierce through. You called me unfit, but I stand here with proof that your measure of fitness was never about ability. It was about keeping doors closed. Well, those doors are open now, and no recording, no insult, no arrogance will shut them again. Her words fell like a hammer, final and undeniable. The crowd was on its feet, roaring, clapping, chanting her name. The hall had transformed into a chorus of solidarity, voices rising to meet hers. And in the middle of it all, Peterson sat in silence, his face pale, his figure diminished. For the first time, the man who had built a career on commanding rooms with rhetoric found himself drowned in a tide of voices louder, prouder, and freer than his own. Crockett's device still rested on the table, a simple object now charged. With historic weight, it wasn't just a recording, it was a mirror. And in that mirror, the nation saw arrogance exposed and dignity triumphant. The crowd's cheers refused to die down. The energy had shifted permanently. The scales tipped. The insult that once threatened to define her was now buried beneath. The roar of validation. And yet, as triumphant as the moment was, the story was not finished. The recording had cracked the mask, but masks once shattered tend to scatter pieces far and wide. What would be revealed in the fallout was something no one in that room could yet predict. The fallout was just beginning, when the roar of the crowd finally softened into something like silence. Crockett remained standing, steady as a mountain in the storm she had summoned. But instead of basking in the applause, she turned her gaze outward, beyond the cameras, beyond the chamber, beyond even Peterson himself, and spoke to a larger truth. This moment, she began, her voice clear, resolute, is not about me. It is not even about him. It is about every person who has ever been told they are unfit to dream, unfit to serve, unfit to belong. And it is about the truth that arrogance can never erase dignity, no matter how loudly it shouts. The room stilled again, but this time the stillness wasn't heavy. It was reverent, a silence that invited every listener to measure their own reflection in her words. She continued, weaving her story into something universal. When my community told me I was enough, I believed them. When my family worked 3 jobs so I could have one chance, I carried them with me. When my city cried out for justice, I stood up because I could not sit down. And every immigrant, every minority, every worker who has ever been told to wait their turn knows what it feels like to stand at that door and hear the word unfit. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Some nodded, some wiped tears, others clasped hands with the people beside them. This was no longer about a debate. It had become testimony, not of a politician, but of a shared human experience. Peterson sat quietly, diminished, his name no longer a weapon, but a cautionary echo. Crockett did not need to look at him anymore. She had shifted the battlefield. This was about truth versus lies, dignity versus dismissal, humanity versus hierarchy. Truth, she said slowly, is stronger than any insult. And dignity is stronger than any arrogance. Because insults die the moment they are spoken. But dignity lives on in every act of resilience, in every barrier broken, in every voice that refuses to be silenced. Applause swelled again, not in frenzy this time, but like a wave, steady and unyielding. She pressed further, lifting the moment into something larger than the walls could contain. This was never about one insult. It was about every insult. Every time a child was told they were not smart enough. Every time a woman was told she was not strong enough. Every time a migrant was told they were not welcome enough. It was about every voice that has ever been silenced and finally being heard. The crescendo of her words reached into the hearts of people who had never stepped foot in that chamber, but who knew exactly what she meant. For those who had crossed oceans, those who had fought to feed their children, those who had endured centuries of being labeled less than. This was vindication made flesh. Crockett drew a breath, and concluded, almost like a benediction, "We do not need permission to belong. We do not need validation from those who build walls of arrogance. We are here. We have always been here. And no insult, no matter how sharp, can erase the truth that we are fit to serve, fit to lead, fit to build a nation that hears all its voices." The applause this time was unstoppable. People rose to their feet not just to celebrate Crockett's victory over Peterson, but to claim the victory as their own. They were clapping for their mothers, their fathers, their ancestors, and their children. They were clapping because something deep within them had been affirmed, that dignity is not granted. It is lived, and no insult can take it away. Crockett lowered her head slightly in thanks, then stepped back. She had reframed the clash entirely. What began as a cutting word meant to diminish her. It transformed into a lesson that elevated everyone watching. The debate was over, but its echo would last far longer than any headline. Because in that chamber, beneath the bright lights and rolling cameras, one truth had been carved into memory. Arrogance collapses, but dignity endures. And for every voice once silenced, that truth was a beginning. Jordan Peterson thought he could end the story with one word: unfit. But Jasmine Crockett carried something far more powerful than an insult. She carried the truth. And when she pressed play on that recording, everything flipped. The giant who stood tall in arrogance shrank, and the woman he tried to dismiss rose into history. That is why this clash matters. It wasn't just a debate on a stage. It was a lesson played out in real time. Arrogance may shout, but courage answers. Dismissal may sting, but truth outlasts it. And dignity, quiet, steady, unshaken, will always find its voice. Crockett's stand is not hers alone. It belongs to every immigrant who has ever been told they don't belong. To every woman told she wasn't strong enough. To every voice silenced by someone towering above them. Her victory is their victory. Her mic drop is their vindication. And now it belongs to you. Because moments like this don't live only in the chamber where they happened. They live in the retelling and the sharing, in the way we choose to remember them. So if you believe dignity is stronger than arrogance, if you believe truth still matters, if you believe courage can silence even the loudest dismissals, then don't just watch history. Carry it forward. Share this story. Subscribe to be part of a community that refuses to be silenced. And stand with those who are told they are unfit, because together we prove they have always been more than enough. The clash that stunned, the courtroom was never about one insult. It was about a truth too powerful to be denied. And now, it's your turn to make sure the world hears it.